G'day everyone, and welcome to the 2 Samuel overview. Michael, one of the ministers here at Engadine, Heathcote. It's Pat, who's normally at 10:45. Pat's been working up our studies, our growth group studies on 2 Samuel, and so we're going to spend a bit of time with him, hearing about what have been the highlights and what's the big picture overview of 2 Samuel. Something you will need as we do this, there'll be some slides that pop up during the next little while. There's lots of information on there, too much to write down, and so make sure you download the notes that go with this video. You'll find them just below the video on our website, and that'll help you follow along, and it'll give you a resource to take away as we look at this book together. Pat, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Do you want to tell us a little bit as we get going? What's really stood out to you? What have you learned, been encouraged by as you've dug into 2 Samuel?
Yeah, well, I started reading it last year and rereading it, and I guess 2 things have stood out during that time. One is I've been encouraged, just seeing God at work throughout history. And for me, that's something I really I resonate with, because very analytical, but I can see God at work through history and being fulfilled in Jesus. I think that's too hard to fake. So it convinces me that it's real, and I found, again, looking at 2 Samuel, it's got some big passages that really point towards Jesus very clearly. And so I found that encouraging. King David, King Jesus.
Yep.
And also reminded of God's grace. And I wasn't expecting this one, but I think the second half of the book, David sins pretty badly. Yet he's still considered righteous by God. And when you work through that, you go, okay, we have Jesus, and so there's a lot to be grateful for there, because he deals with our sin. And so those 2 themes sort of stood out for me, and it was sort of encouraging me to keep doing the Old Testament and see how it looks forward to the New. Yeah,
I think it's something we're going to keep seeing this term, isn't it? The highs and lows of David, and how that helps us in our highs and lows as we follow Christ.
We have both, yeah.
Do you want to tell us what's the book about?
Wow, book's about a lot of things, and it took me a while to work it out, because I got lost in the narrative. I mean, it is a compelling narrative. You could just read it and go, wow, this is like a blockbuster movie. And there's, complex characters. Not everyone's wearing a black hat or a white hat, it's very tricky. And there's just personal conflict, corrupt behaviour, there's rebellion, there's all sorts of things going on, intriguing. It's also about one of the greatest kings in the history of the world, King David. And he's an unbelievable king, and he conquers, his known world. So he has a lot of victories, but we also see his character and how he's submissive to God, but also sins. So you think, wow, and I was sitting there going, wow, on earth am I going to write studies about this? And then I stumbled across John Woodhouse's commentary.
Yep.
A brilliant commentary, 600 plus pages of it. It sort of reminded me that the theme is about God's king and the kingdom. And I think that is really, really helpful, because when you see that, you say, I see what this book's about. It's about God's king. So I have this category of kingship and what is required, and it helps us look forward to a son of David, a true king who will fulfill the promises to David. And so that naturally points us towards Jesus, and we see God bringing everything under Jesus in the New Testament. So so I think that big picture theme is really helpful. And I've got there's 3 movements in the book, and I think these 3 movements, there's an up, a down, and a question mark. So chapters 1 to 10 are the up, it's all good. Chapters 11 to 20, well, it's pretty stinky.
That's the down.
And 20 to 24, it's like the kingdom's assessed. And so we're seeing this idea of the kingdom and how is it at work, I think helps you to see the whole, and we'll talk through that in a little bit. And I guess just remember, it's not a linear story. Like a lot of the Old Testament uses time and history or geography, and that didn't work this time. It has phrases like, in the course of time. So it's just to remember that it's thematic, and so if you remember, it's trying to think about how of this category of God's king and his kingdom, and then it ties the whole book together, I think. Okay,
so it's telling us history, but not quite in the way that we would write history. So we write things chronologically, start at chapter 1, get to chapter, I've forgotten how many, it's 23. I missed it, 24. But these have been arranged in a particular way to make a point about God and his king and his kingdom. So there's 3 movements that you talked about. First one's the up. Do you want to tell us what that first section's about?
Yeah, so it's a long up.
Yeah.
It's a long journey.
Yeah.
So it is a long journey, because we've sort of forgotten, a couple of years ago we did 1 Samuel.
We did.
And you might have realised in 1 Samuel 16, David's anointed. And
Which means God chooses him as the
Yeah,
king.
he chooses him as his king, but
Yep.
he's not king yet. He's still running around doing stuff.
Yeah.
And so 10, 15 years later, we're in 2 Samuel, and he's still not king. And you're going, wow, this guy's patient. And just, he's given an opportunity to grasp the throne with the death of Saul. And Amalekite comes up with the throne and with the crown and the amulet, and says, oh, here they are, and he doesn't take them. And it's interesting, David is really shown in a very positive light throughout this whole thing. He doesn't grasp at the throne, he waits for God. He trusts in God. He prays to God, he asks his guidance. In the end, he acts wisely with a whole bunch of people in situations, and we just see it in so many different ways that he's viewed by the people as this great leader.
Okay.
But it's very messy, this chapter at the beginning. Lots of battles, the fight between David's house and Saul's house, and intrigue, and I won't go into it because when you read it, it's really obvious that what's going on.
Yeah.
But it's a long journey for David, and this positive view of him, I think, summarises this whole section. It's national and positive. And so he eventually gets the kingship in chapter 5, and he then takes over Jerusalem, and that's the political centre, and he thinks, oh, I'll bring the ark in chapter 6 and 7, or 6 into Jerusalem. And he gets a lesson in God is holy. And there's all sorts of echoes there to other passages, but he can't treat God lightly. He's still got to deal with God on God's terms. And then we get this incredible passage in chapter 7. So David says, oh, I want to build a house for God. I've been living in this panelled house. And then God says, no. You're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. And so I guess this, just a segue into biblical theology, there's a summary there that I think is just, it's a bit of a detour, but it's helpful to see that if you only knew a few passages in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel 7 would be one of them.
It's one of the key ones,
It's
isn't
a pivotal one because you've got, in Genesis 3, you're looking for this serpent crusher. And we did the big picture, and it's up on the wall, if you can actually make it to church.
They're not allowed in anymore.
Not that you're allowed to
when
see
you
it,
get back, it'll be on the wall.
But if it was on the wall, there it is. Genesis 3, we're looking for a sin crusher. Someone who will crush the serpent. And then in Genesis 12, we get Abraham and the promises of, great nation, his name will be great, land, blessing. And I think this is fantastic. Then Exodus 19, we get the Sinai covenant and God's great redemptive acts. And then we come to Joshua, and he starts to conquer the land. And so, lots happening all this time. And then we come to David in 2 Samuel 7, and you think, this is looking pretty promising. Here we've got God's king and God's place under his rule, and his name's great. It's really looking like the Abrahamic covenant is starting to stick. And so 2 Samuel 7 then takes this idea and says, well, how will God's promises to Abraham be fulfilled? And it's now viewed through the lens of the king. And so we now, in the Old Testament, as we look forward, we see that they pick up this idea of king and they extend it and say, well, the king will be a suffering servant. The king will also won't be military, It will be, this king will be, yes, the son of David, but also the son of God. And he will get eternal, in Daniel 7, gets the
eternal kingdom.
The eternal kingdom. And so we see all of these categories and themes, the stump of Jesse in Isaiah 11. So anyway, there's plenty, right?
Lots going on.
Lots of categories. And then when Jesus turns up, he's, the first thing we find out in Matthew is, his genealogy, which points back to being the son of David. And then, then in Mark, it's the kingdom of God is near, and, he's the son of God, and he's my son, I'm well pleased. There's all these hooks, which if you haven't read 2 Samuel 7, and you miss out this category of king. And so this category of kingship's key to understanding who Jesus is. You don't need it, but it certainly enriches your understanding. So, so it's phenomenal. And so, Jesus comes. And I think Acts 2 is, actually not Acts 2, it is Acts 2. It is Acts 2. In Acts 2, Peter points back to this time and says, Jesus fulfills this. And he points it out pretty clearly to people and says, he's the one. So, it's pretty exciting stuff.
Okay, so that's our first section. It's very positive. It's all going uphill. God's fulfilling all these promises he's made from right at the beginning of the Bible. Second section of 2 Samuel, things take a bit of a turn though.
They do.
What goes on in the second section?
Yeah, and I really should finish chapter.
Oh, you can finish the other bit if you want. Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It is all uphill, and I wanted to point out one little section is the chapters 8 to 10. Because although chapters 8 to 10 are like this crossover between these two things, so a lot of people stop at chapter 8. That's the end of the positive period, and then we move into this next section. I kind of Well, I couldn't work it out. Because
Yep.
I could argue either way.
Yep.
Because when you look at it, the map, you could see chapter 8 says, well, basically David wins north, south, east, west.
Okay.
He just conquers
Wins
all around and
everywhere.
extends Israel, and some people say it even goes beyond the map that I've drawn. And you go, well, okay, so it's pretty positive. And there's a key phrase there where it says, God gave David victory wherever he went. And you go, okay, so it's not, yes, David's cunning, yes, he's a great military leader, but it's God who's at that work.
Yeah.
And then chapter 9 and 10 are interesting because David shows kindness. And the word is hesed, and I think the women, when they went to the Ruth conference,
Yeah, we talked about
the word hesed was used a lot,
Yeah.
so it appears a lot in the Old Testament.
It's God's loving kindness, his steadfast love.
Yeah, it's
that
not
idea.
just kindness, it's far bigger than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and here's David he's been showing that kindness from God, and here he is showing it to Jonathan. It's interesting, they had a covenant back in 1 Samuel. He says, don't ever blot out my name, and don't forget me, and here he
Yes.
is showing kindness.
Yeah.
And so he's following through. He also then shows it to a nation who, earlier in 1 Samuel, was gouging out the eyes of Israel. So you think, this is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't accept it, so it doesn't go so well for them. So there's this interesting reacting to the king's kindness. So 9 and 10 are sort of that...
Transitional.
transition. They could be in the good, and they could
Yeah.
be in this second section, which you go, well, it just looks all downhill from here.
Yeah. All right, well, take us into the second section. Take us down the hill.
Down the hill.
What happens in the second
Well, there's three sections, I think. You see David's personal sin. You see his family feud, if you like, a decade of destruction, as I
Yeah.
like to call it.
Yep.
And then there's
It's a happy title, isn't it? Yeah.
and then there's the divided nation, where it almost goes back into civil war. And so those three things, so the David's sin, 11 to 12, Absalom and all the events of his family, 13 to 18, and then 19 to 20.
Okay.
And when you zoom out, you see this whole section is personal and negative, whereas the first part was positive and national.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that we're now sort of looking behind the scenes, and that's why I think it's thematic, because there could be periods of overlap.
Yep.
And David is passive, he's not wise, and he's sinful. So it's not quite the highs that we just experienced in the first 10 chapters.
Yeah.
We see a lot of bad behaviour, adultery, murder, rape, deceit, more murder, rebellion. It just goes on and on, and you think, whoa.
Some big black dots next to this great king.
lots of black dots.
Yeah.
And we see that the human heart is really deceitful. And I think you go, okay, great, but why do I need to be told all this? And I think when you reflect, it's chapter 7, Abrahamic promises looking fulfilled, but not sin. Genesis 3 hasn't been dealt with. He's not the sin crusher. He's not good enough to deal with sin. And the consequences of the sin infect his family, his nation, and everything.
Yeah.
And so, yes, David is great, and yes, David is forgiven by God, but at the same time, he isn't able to deal with sin.
Yeah.
And so we are looking forward for a future king
Yeah.
who is able to deal with sin. And so you can see why 2 Samuel just keeps pointing you to Jesus.
It's pushing us forwards, doesn't it? Yeah. All right, so we've got the up, we've got the down.
Well, we've got his family tree,
Yeah.
which
Oh,
I keep forgetting that I've got another
That's right.
hook.
There's a slide coming up. And it's in your handout. Good luck reading it. It's in
Yeah,
small
but I
font.
thought I wanted to put the family tree in there because there are a lot of names. And when you
Yes.
first read 2 Samuel, you go, oh man, who are all these people?
Yeah.
And it just reminds me of my family. Some of them live in Bega. And when you ask them a story, they always tell you about the family tree of somebody else because they put it in
Okay.
context. So they know everyone who knows everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
And you go, who are all these people?
Yeah.
And it's a bit like that with reading
Yeah.
2 Samuel 7. So I've done the family tree there. I'm not going to go through it, but a couple of call-outs. Zeruiah, or a name I can't pronounce, she's the sister of David. And she has 3 sons, Joab being one of them. And these 3 sons feature heavily. So they're the nephews of David.
Yep.
And David says a couple of times, I can't handle these sons, they're too strong for me. So there's a love-hate relationship with them. And it's quite an interesting interaction. And they're fiercely loyal, but very disobedient. And they murder, plot and scheme. And so they're interesting characters. You'll also see, obviously, the different sons like Ammon and Absalom and Tamar. And so you'll see how they're related. But a little interesting call-out again is the red people in my little picture there, is they are like the line that eventually leads through to Jesus. And when you come to...
So Jesse, David, Solomon.
when you come to Matthew, they're called out. And an interesting little thing of God's grace is that Bathsheba was married to Uriah, who David murdered effectively. And guess who's in the family line that leads through
Yeah.
to Jesus? So God is even able to use David's sin and still achieve his purposes.
Yeah.
So it can't be thwarted,
Yeah.
even by sin. So there's all these things,
Yeah.
and I just wanted to sneak that one in there.
Yeah.
So
Excellent. It'd be helpful, that family tree. I'm sure the Bible readers for term 3 are very much looking forward to serving us with all these names. So we've got the up, we've got the down. Third part's your question mark. You labelled it as before. What's going on in the third part?
Well, this is tricky. So I'm going to throw a technical term. It's a chiastic structure.
Yep.
And if you read any of the literature, they love finding chiastic structures. So basically think mirror. There's an outer section that mirror each other, an inner section, and then a core.
Which tends to be the main point.
Yeah,
Is that
so
right?
it sort of focuses you in to say, well, that's sort of the clue as to what this passage is about. And so it's very well constructed. So you have sin and wrath and the judgment of God. You have David's military men and the strength. And then you have this thing about hope, and it's all about God. And it's David, Psalm 18 is more or less repeated in whole here.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. There's slight differences, but basically the same. And that could be viewed as the beginning of David's kingship, could be. And then you've got his last words at the end of his life, so the beginning and the end perhaps. And you say, well, the beginning and the end reflect on God. It's God who gave him the victory. It's God who was winning things for David. And there's allusions to Hannah's prayer back at the beginning of 1 Samuel, where it's, God humbles the proud and lifts up his king and deals with his plans in a sovereign manner. Like, you can, there's echoes there. There's also echoes of Exodus, of God thundering from the clouds and coming down. So David paints this pretty big picture. And he also has this statement that he's dealt with because of his righteousness. And you say, hang on, I just read chapters 10 to 20. You are a rotter. So how can you say that?
Yeah.
And you'll have to work that through in the studies. But I think you've got to think in terms of covenant. God did not choose David because he was sinless. He chose him because of his grace, and he deals with him. And you see this contrast between David and Saul. And David is, he sins, he acknowledges his sin and turns to God. Saul tried to dodge it. And that contrast, I think, is the difference. And so you sort of, it's a reminder to us that, well, we're fortunate we have Jesus, and he's dealt with our sin and that grace, and we can, we should turn to him. And I think in Romans it picks up on this idea of righteousness and covenant. So that's quite an important highlight. Yeah. And I guess finishing on in chapter 24, it's just incredible to read. But they have this. David sins again. We're not told. Well, he tries to count the army, and we're not told the reasons why it's a sin, but it's a sin. And God gives him a choice. He chooses the 3 days of plague under the hands of God. God relents, interestingly. And David has this statement, he says, I, the shepherd, have done wrong. Let your hand fall on me and my family. And you go, wow. And then Jesus comes along as the good shepherd and says, I will lay down my life. And so there's another connection there. Yeah. And it's interesting, this place where it is done. It's just, I know it's a little segue, but where God relents, he tells David to go and sacrifice there, which he does. And then later on in 1 Kings, we're told that's where Solomon builds the temple. Okay. And we're also told its other name, which tells us that that's where Abraham took Isaac to sacrifice him. And God provides a ram as a substitute. So you have this idea of sin, judgment, substitute, sacrifice. And this place pretty much is where Jesus dies on the cross. That's right. All those years later.
All these covenants
all
come
these
together,
things
Abraham
and all pointing to Jesus. So you can see 2 Samuel, incredible book, because in so many ways the idea of king, you can't miss it. He keeps pointing you to Jesus. In so many ways you go, oh, I get this. So it's an exciting book. I don't know how many times I've read it in the last few months. So you can read it more than once. Please do. It's definitely worth a read. Definitely helpful, and it's a good read.
Excellent. If you do want to read it, a helpful way to do that in the growth group studies, Pat's put together a reading plan that you can read over 3 weeks. And so you can kind of just read a chapter or so a day, which is quite achievable. And it's kind of one of those things, if you miss a day, there's no actual dates next to it, so you can come back to it the next day. Don't give up, just keep plugging away at it.
I think you'll get through quicker, to be honest. Once you start, it's hard to stop.
There's some good stuff in there. Final question. What are some helpful resources for us if we want to think a bit bigger, push ourselves a bit harder?
Yeah, so I found a few things. The St Helens Bishop Gate online resources, they're really, really quite well done. There's some good stuff. I found...
bit of show and tell.
Oh, a bit of show and tell, yeah. So I found if you want to think about biblical theology and the thing, you can't go past Intro to the Bible, PTC course. I did this a long time ago. Really helpful. Really helpful. There's some follow-up stuff they do with Promise to Fulfillment as well, but that, if you haven't done PTC course, if you only ever do one, this is the one. It just gets you thinking about the big story.
Yep.
It's really, really helpful. Two books that are quite readable, that are not heavy duty, they're not academic, they're more about application. So Tim Chester's one on 2 Samuel for you. This is quite readable, quite helpful. I found this one a little bit heavier, but different way of thinking, but also it's, that covers 2 books. So for that thickness,
Good
so
value
that's
for
actually
money.
pretty good. And then if you really want to push yourself, then I think John Woodhouse's book,
Yeah, absolutely.
it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's
So you mentioned that earlier. It's 600 pages. It's heavy going. Oh, sorry, it's not heavy going. It's heavy going in the sense that it covers everything, and it can be. It'll cover the technical things, but I think he does it in a way that's actually very accessible.
It is unusual for that sort of thing. It's
yeah.
not a technical one, like the Pillar Commentary series, which I really like, has more technical stuff,
Yeah.
whereas this is, you're right, it is still, he's still almost like mini sermons on each chapter.
Yeah.
And so he's thinking about an application each time, which I think
Yeah.
makes it much more approachable. So
Yeah.
yeah, if you wanted to really think that one, and he uses the Lord's Prayer to connect 2 Samuel to Jesus. So, he's
Yeah.
got all these sort of insights and stuff that are really worth reading.
Yep. Right, we're getting nerdy, so we'll stop talking about those things. There's some helpful books, though. Thank you, Pat, for sharing with us. Hopefully that's been a really helpful introduction to 2 Samuel for you. Up, down, question mark, that's our structure. And we'll dig into that over the next term. See you later.